Yo, what's up? Welcome back to another episode of the SWUS College Football Saturday. Going to go through as many games as I can here. Obviously, the live show at 10 a.m. We'll go through all of them. I'm not going to be able to go through all of them in this video, but I'll go through as many as I can, rattle them off. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the SWUS. The SWUS. SWUS. Hey, get the SWUS.
First up, we got UCLA on the road in Happy Valley here. Penn State is now laying 28.5 points. Total sitting at 46.5. Take a look at the pie charts, and according to the data, the public action's coming in on the UCLA side. 60% of the tickets, 50% of the money coming in on UCLA. Obviously, like I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. I'm not going to say that every single pie charts. Just know this data tends to be a little unreliable. So what do we think about this matchup? Well, for starters, this might be the biggest mismatch of all time. UCLA's offense going on the road into Happy Valley. I mean, they might not get a first down. UCLA's been terrible offensively, 106 in yards per play, 129th in success rate, no run game whatsoever. But even if they had a run game, probably wouldn't be there against this Penn State defensive front, one of the best run defenses in college football. Last week, we saw this Penn State defense shut down Illinois, and we know how good that offense could be. I mean, we saw that offense go on the road into Lincoln and beat Nebraska outright. Luke Altmaier, no stranger to playing against tough defenses. Penn State held them to 7. I was lucky to get my Illinois plus 18 cover there. The only case you could possibly make for UCLA scoring points on the Penn State defense, maybe you could say it's a bit of a flat spot or a look-ahead spot for Penn State. They do travel out west to play USC next week, but I mean, even that's razor thin, because I'm pretty sure Penn State's defense going at 60% could probably still shut this UCLA offense out. But honestly, on the other side, UCLA's defense really hasn't been that bad. I mean, they've actually been okay against the run. They're 33rd in yards per carry, 41st in effective rush, sitting at 45th in DFVI. The offense has been so bad, and the final scores have been pretty embarrassing. People haven't really noticed that the UCLA defense really isn't that bad. In their last 2 games, they played LSU and Oregon, 2 of the most dangerous, high-powered offenses in the country. They held them to 34 points a game, just 5.92 yards per play. I mean, not that that's great, but it's LSU and Oregon. I mean, they're putting up 60, 70 pieces on bad teams. So basically, the point I'm making is this UCLA defense isn't nearly as bad as the UCLA offense, and both of these teams run slow paces. UCLA 130th in plays per game so far, Penn State 72nd, so I'm inclined to take a look at the under here. I mean, I don't think UCLA is going to score any points, and I don't think the defense is that bad. Problem is the market's moving against me. It was at 44.5 on Sunday. It's now up to 46.5, indicating some sharp action must have come in on the other side, or at least that's what it's indicative of. At the moment, I don't have a bet down on this one. We'll talk about it on the live show, but I'm leaning under 46.5. Next up is Missouri, Texas A&M, and I already uploaded a video on this one, so here it is. All right, like I said, Mizzou's on the road for this one. Looks like it's dropping to 1.5. It was at 2. You still can get 2s. Texas A&M looking like a short home favorite. Total sitting at 48.5. Pretty much across the board there. So let's get into this one. And both of these teams coming off wins. Missouri's win was 2 weeks ago. They're coming off a bye. Neither team covered. Texas A&M was laying 5.5 or 5, I believe, in that game against Arkansas. Mizzou was laying a pretty big number. Didn't cover against Missouri. So both teams win. Neither team covers. So what do we think about this matchup? Well, the Missouri offense so far this season has been, I don't want to say disappointing, because it's been good. I mean, their last 2 games, that was the first time they saw Power 4 opponents, Vanderbilt and Boston College. Neither team has a particularly great defense. Missouri averaging 28.5 points per game, 40.3% success rate. I mean, 5.88 yards per play. That's not bad. But we came into this season expecting Missouri to be one of the most explosive offenses in the entire country, one of the most explosive offenses in the SEC. We really haven't seen that yet. The bright spot for Missouri the last 2 games has been Nate Noel running the football. 46 carries, 320 yards, 6.96 yards per carry, averaging almost 7 yards per carry in his last 2 games. Here's the problem. I don't think that's going to be there in this one on the road at Kyle Field. I mean, Texas A&M's been playing great defense against the run this season. In the last 3 games, they're allowing just 3.09 yards per carry. Keep in mind, Mike Elko is coaching this defense, and we know what he did with Duke last year. Duke had one of the best run defenses in the ACC under his tenure, and that's with Duke's talent. So we know Mike Elko knows how to shut the run game down. So Nate Noel's been killing it for Missouri. I don't think the run game's going to be there necessarily in this road game against Texas A&M, which means the pressure's going to be on Brady Cook to produce. And we really haven't seen it yet. I mean, I'm not going to say he's off to a bad start, but I'd say he's off to an underwhelming start. 946 yards, just over 7 yards per pass attempt, 4 touchdowns, 1 interception, struggling a little bit when pressured. QB rating is down, yards per pass attempt is down when pressured. Again, I wouldn't say Brady Cook's been struggling, but coming into this season, I mean, after what they did last year, Brady Cook's back, Luther Burden's back, one of the best receivers in college football. We expected this to be a seriously explosive offense, and we really just haven't seen it yet. But I have good news for Brady Cook and the Mizzou offense. This is not the Texas A&M defensive front of years past. They're playing elite defense against the run, but look at the pass rush numbers. 66th in pass rush grade, 102nd in sack rate, 58th in pressure rate. I mean, this is Texas A&M. This has been one of the most elite pass rushes in college football for several years. Now, maybe Mike Elko's running the defense a little differently. I can't put my finger on why this is, because they still have elite talent in terms of edge rushers, but the pressure just hasn't been there. And Missouri's pass protection has been elite. Top 25, even top 10 in most of these numbers. 4th in the FBS in pressure rate allowed. So I actually think Brady Cook on the road at Kyle Field is going to have time to throw. And although we haven't seen it yet, I think we're going to see Brady Cook have his first big game throwing the football. Texas A&M's pass defense hasn't been nearly as good as its run defense. They haven't been getting cooked through the air, but, I mean, 7.4 yards per pass attempt allowed in their last 3 games, 259 yards per game. Not terrible, but not as elite as their numbers against the run. And I know we haven't seen it yet from Brady Cook, but it's the first big conference game. We see a lot of players get off to slow starts, and then when conference play starts, they really kick it into gear. They're coming off the bye week. I think it's coming. I think Brady Cook's going to have a big game. We're finally going to see Missouri's offense look like the Mizzou offense we were expecting entering the season. So I like the matchup for Brady Cook. Now, what about the other side? What do we think about the matchup for Texas A&M's offense? And this is where it gets a little tougher because we don't know who's playing quarterback for Texas A&M. I mean, is it going to be Marcel Reed again? Is Connor Wegman going to return? We really don't know. He's listed as I believe he's listed as a game-time decision again. He's missed 3 straight games, I believe now. Texas A&M has been running the football. 42nd in yards per carry, 29th in success rate, 9th in effective rush. No question, when Marcel Reed's playing quarterback for Texas A&M, they have one of the better rushing attacks in the country. Like I said, he's a dual threat guy. As far as throwing the football, a little bit underwhelming. I mean, he did have that breakout game on the road in the Swamp against Florida, but, I mean, he only dropped back to pass 17 times, and it was his first start. It might have been a little bit of catching Florida off guard. The Gators weren't even expecting to play him, and he came in. I think he was 11 for 17 with these numbers. Since then, it's definitely been shaky. I mean, at home against Bowling Green, didn't really do much, just a 128 passer rating. Remember, on the college football scale, that's not very good. He had an okay game against Arkansas, nothing special at all. So although I definitely respect the Texas A&M run game if Marcel Reed's playing quarterback, as far as defending the pass, if Marcel Reed's in there, I'm not really worried about that for Missouri. If you look at his rushing stats, he's definitely an athlete. 5.5 yards per carry, over 200 yards rushing. Keep in mind, he's only played in 3 games, so he's definitely a threat to run. But here's the thing. I mean, Missouri's defense has been great. Great against the run. 24th in yards per carry, 16th in success rate. They're sitting at 27th in DFEI. They've been solid against the pass as well, but a little shaky in that game against Castellanos. We'll talk about that in a second. And speaking of Castellanos, what I like about that game, well, first let's look at their run defense against Boston College and Vanderbilt. Those are the 2 Power 4 teams they've played. Neither could run the ball in Missouri. Just 3.15 yards per carry allowed, under 100 yards rushing per game allowed in those games by Missouri's defense. So in Missouri's last 2 games, which happen to be their 2 toughest opponents so far, they didn't let them do anything on the ground. The run defense was great in those games, and I especially like it. Why? What do Boston College and Vanderbilt both have? Dual threat quarterbacks, Diego Pavia with Vanderbilt and Castellanos with Boston College. So I love to see these numbers knowing they just played 2 teams with quarterbacks that are great athletes. So that's a really nice sign heading into Texas A&M if Marcel Reed's going to be the quarterback. Look at Thomas Castellanos' numbers on the ground against Mizzou. We know how crazy of an athlete he is. 13 carries, 16 yards, just 1.2 yards per carry. Now, there are 2 sacks affecting these numbers, but still, the longest rush in this game for Castellanos was 7 yards. So, I mean, hats off to the Missouri defense because this dude's an electric athlete. Couldn't get anything going with his legs. Now, here's where it gets to the part I'm a little worried about when it comes to Missouri's defense. Castellanos was actually making some plays through the air. 16 of 28, 249 yards, 3 touchdowns, 2 picks, 152.9 passer rating despite throwing 2 interceptions. That's not great, and that was a close finish. So if Castellanos doesn't throw those picks, Missouri might lose that game. Look, I'm not going to take this one game sample size and turn that into, hey, Missouri's defense is vulnerable against the pass. I'm not going to do that, but I am a little bit worried about it. I mean, Castellanos, he's not the most talented thrower of the ball. He's solid, but he's not an elite thrower. And the reason that worries me a little bit, if Connor Wegman plays, he might be able to make plays on Missouri's secondary because Connor Wegman can definitely throw the ball. Now, if you just started watching college football this year, you might be thinking, Kyle, no, he can. I watched that Notre Dame game. No, he cannot throw the ball. And you'd be fair in saying that. He was absolutely dreadful in the Notre Dame game. But the truth is, over the course of his career, especially at home at Kyle Field, he can have big games throwing the football. So if Connor Wegman plays, I'm a little worried that he has a big bounce back game through the air on Missouri's secondary. But in my opinion, that's kind of a big if. I mean, he's been listed as a game time decision in back-to-back weeks. Who knows? He might be more seriously injured than they're leading on. We've seen these college coaches use the injury report strategically. I'm looking at you, Kyle Whittingham, where they know their quarterback's more injured than they're letting on. But they just keep listing him as a game time decision because they're not required to give updated injury reports like the NFL is. So they use it strategically. How do we know Texas A&M, Mike Elko, isn't doing the same thing here? I mean, he's been a game time decision 2 straight weeks. Here he is, 3rd straight week, game time decision. So I don't know if he's going to play or not. If I'm being honest, though, I think Missouri wins the game either way. That's the side I'm on. I'm at Missouri +2. If you're looking for some trends, got a couple positive ones for Missouri. Mizzou, let me pull up the graphic. Since 2022, Mizzou 7-2 against the spread on the road, 10-4 against the spread as underdog. So you got Mizzou on the road, Mizzou as a dog, very profitable in both those spots over the last 2 seasons. And Texas A&M, it's the opposite. 5-9 against the number as a home favorite, 5-8-1 against the number after a win. So 2 nice-looking trends for Mizzou, 2 terrible-looking trends for Texas A&M. I am on Missouri here. I bet the +2. The way I see it, if Marcel Reed is the quarterback, I think Mizzou closes as a favorite. So we should be holding some nice value with a Mizzou +2 bet. If Connor Wegman plays, yeah, we might be in a little bit of trouble. It might be a coin flip game, back and forth game, but I still think Missouri is the better team, and we haven't seen their best effort yet. So I think Missouri wins this game regardless. Give me Mizzou +2. So yeah, I'm on Mizzou. I bet it at +2. It's up to 2.5 now, so the market moved against me here. I mean, I'm not sure what I'm missing. In my opinion, Missouri's the much better team. Question mark at the quarterback position for Texas A&M. I think Mizzou wins outright, so it's Missouri for me here. Next game. Next, we're heading up to the Big Ten. We got Purdue on the road in Madison for this one. Wisconsin laying 12.5 points at home. Total sitting at 44.5. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to this data, action is pretty split on this one. About 50-50 across the board here. Maybe money slightly leaning towards Wisconsin, but it's been bouncing around. This number did touch 14 for a little bit on Tuesday morning, but it's been bought back down to 12.5. Pretty much 12.5 across the board as I'm recording this. So what do we think of this matchup? Well, Wisconsin has owned Purdue. I mean, I think they've taken 10 or 11 in a row, something like that. Purdue hasn't even really covered the number very often. We have seen 5 straight overs. If you're looking for a pattern, 5 straight overs in this matchup. But the thing is, we're looking at new eras for these teams. Obviously, Jim Leonard's gone, the DC, the Jim Leonard era of Wisconsin defense. He's been gone for a couple years now. We got Ryan Walters coaching Purdue now. This Luke Fickell experiment with Wisconsin doesn't seem to be working. Basically, what I'm trying to say is the gap between these two teams isn't as great as it was, say, 5-6 years ago. So Purdue's still struggling, though. So how do they match up? Purdue's offense, I mean, Hudson Card really struggling to get a passing game going. 118th in yards per attempt, 99th in success rate per dropback. They might have a bit of a run game, though. They're 52nd in effective rush, just 73rd in yards per carry. That's a result of who they've played, and we'll talk about that in a second. And I know counting on Purdue to go on the road up to Madison and run the ball on the Wisconsin defensive front, I mean, that's just crazy to even say. But like I said, this is a new era for this is not Jim Leonard's Wisconsin defense. Wisconsin's actually struggled a little bit against the run. And if you look at Purdue's rushing numbers, yeah, they struggled to run the ball in Notre Dame and Nebraska. I mean, who hasn't? Those are 2 really good defensive fronts. In their other 2 games, they're averaging 8.38 yards per carry, over 255 rushing yards per game. Wisconsin's defense is not on the same, or at least their defensive front is not on the same level of Notre Dame and Nebraska. And yeah, you could say Wisconsin's run defense numbers are a little skewed because they've played USC and Alabama. But look at their first 2 games. Western Michigan and South Dakota. Those two teams average over 4 yards per carry on Wisconsin, over 122 rushing yards per game. So this Wisconsin run defense just might not be very good. Keep in mind, this is a Purdue offensive line that brings back 4 starters from last year. Yes, they've underperformed a little bit in terms of pass protection, but look at the left side of this graphic. 34th in line yards, 39th in stuff rate, 40th in run blocking grade. They've actually done a decent job creating space in the run. Now, the tough part of this matchup is Hudson Card's just been so terrible when he's seen pressure so far this year, and we just talked about how Purdue's offensive line has struggled in pass protection, so that's tough to take him to go on the road up here in Madison. But Wisconsin's pass rush hasn't really been that great. Just 90th in sack rate, 86th in pressure rate. They were able to generate some pressure on Hayden Wolf in the Western Michigan game, but Western Michigan's offensive line is not comparable to Purdue's, especially a Purdue offensive line that's bringing back a ton of production from last year. So I'm not sure if Wisconsin's pass rush is able to get home consistently in this one. And on the other side of the ball, we got the Wisconsin offense. Look, on paper, they're going to be able to run the ball on Purdue. Purdue's run defense has been terrible. They've been getting bulldozed. 129th in yards per carry allowed, 107th in effective rush. Not that Wisconsin's been great running the ball. I mean, they're just 60th in effective rush, but they do have a run game. Look at Purdue's run defense numbers from their last 3 games. They're allowing over 288 rushing yards per game, 6.56 yards per carry. Granted, those 3 games were against Nebraska, Oregon State, and Notre Dame. All 3 of those teams have better rushing attacks than Wisconsin this year. Oregon State's like 2nd in the country in effective rush. Look, by no means am I saying Purdue's going to shut down Wisconsin's rushing attack. I'm not saying that, but Braden Locke is playing quarterback, which means the defensive game plan for Ryan Walters is going to be pretty simple here. Take away the run, force Braden Locke to make throws. I don't know. One-dimensional offenses tend to be easier to stop, which means it's going to be Purdue for me here. Purdue first half plus 7.5. I think they will be able to run the ball, especially early. I don't know if I would touch the full game because eventually that Wisconsin rushing attack is going to break through. That Purdue defensive front can't hold up forever. But I think in the first half, Ryan Walters can put together some kind of defensive scheme that slows down Wisconsin for a little bit. So I'm getting more than a touchdown. Purdue first half plus 7.5. Next up, we got Boston College on the road at UVA here. Virginia is laying 1 or 1.5, depending on your sports book. Total sitting at 52.5 across the. Or there are a couple 52s out there. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to this data, action's coming in on the Boston College side. Over 60% of the tickets, over 80% of the money. So according to this data, sharp action on Boston College, but as I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. Even though this one is in line with the line movement, it was up at 3.5, then 2.5, been bought down to 1. Seems like it hit some resistance, saw some buyback on UVA at 1. So how do these two teams match up? Well, we know Boston College is looking to run the ball. They're 25th in run frequency. Offensively, they've been okay this year, 45th in OFEI, maybe a little bit disappointing. Keep in mind, Castellanos didn't play last week. Let's give some props to Virginia defensively. I knew that they would be better because they brought back a ton of production from last year, but 51st in effective rush, 52nd in DFEI. Virginia's got themselves a little bit of a defense here. They're 33rd in the country in yards per carry. So the question is, can Virginia stop Boston College on the ground? And Boston College rushing numbers in their last 3 games, I mean, just 3.12 yards per carry, 106 rushing yards per game, just 38.1% success rate. Keep in mind, as I mentioned, Castellanos did not play in the Western Kentucky game, but still, this is an offense that needs to run the ball. They have not been running the ball. I mean, last week against Western Kentucky, this is not a defensive program, Western Kentucky. They averaged just 4.38 yards per play as a team, scored just 21 points in the game. Now, Castellanos didn't play, but what this shows us is how one-dimensional this Boston College offense is. I mean, he is the team. That's a really poor offensive performance against a defense that they should have no problem scoring on. And like I said earlier, Virginia's done a solid job defending the run recently. It's actually been the pass that's given them problems in their last 3 games against FBS opponents. I filtered out the FCS game. They're allowing over 322 passing yards per game, 8.23 yards per attempt. So they've been struggling to defend the pass, which makes this game tough to predict. I mean, is Castellanos going to play? I think based on what I've seen and what I've read that he is going to play, but coming off an injury, relying on his arm, we know Castellanos is an athlete, usually making plays with his legs. You trust him to go on the road here and beat this Virginia team that's pretty good with just his arm? Don't really like the sound of that. On the other side, we got the Virginia offense, and what I like about the Virginia offense is they're showing us a little bit of versatility recently. Here are their numbers on the year. They're 43rd in yards per play, 42nd in PPA, 31st in yards per carry. Rushing numbers look surprisingly good. We knew that they would be able to throw the ball this year. They brought back Calandria, quarterback, but did not realize that Virginia was going to have a rushing attack too. Here's the problem. Boston College has played really good defense against the run. They're actually 27th in the country in yards per carry allowed, 21st in success rate. Now, I mentioned before that this Virginia offense showed us some versatility recently. In the last 2 games, the passing attack wasn't really there. Just 194 yards through the air, 6.4 yards per attempt. And this is an offense that's led by its quarterback, Calandria. The reason they were still able to move the ball a bit and were able to win one of these games is the run game showed up. 5.76 yards per carry, over 253 rushing yards per game against Coastal. Okay, Coastal's defenses, it is what it is. They're not terrible, but they're certainly not great. Maryland's got a good defensive front. So, I mean, to be able to run the ball on these 2 defenses definitely gives me a little more confidence when it comes to this Virginia offense. The thing is, like I said, Boston College has been playing really good defense against the run. In the last 3 games, they're allowing just 3.7 yards per carry, 142 rushing yards per game. So even though Virginia has shown us a little bit of life recently in terms of running the ball, I don't think so. I think Boston College should force them to throw. But here's the thing. I don't know if I trust this Boston College defense against the pass. We looked at their numbers against the run in the last 3 games. They look great. Look at their numbers against the pass in the same sample size, last 3 games. Definitely not as great. 7.2 yards per attempt allowed. That's not bad. 44.8% success rate per dropback. So teams have been able to throw the ball on Boston College. Calandria is coming off back-to-back games where he didn't play his best. I think he's due for a nice game throwing the ball. So I think Calandria is able to move the ball through the air in this one, which kind of points me to the over. And the market certainly agrees. On Sunday, this was 50.5. It got bet up to 53. Now it's down at 52.5. So this has moved up a whole 2 points now from the original total. Sharp actually came in on the over, apparently. I'm with that. I agree with the movement. The problem is I don't want to bet it yet because I don't believe Castellanos has been confirmed in yet, and I do not want to be holding an over ticket if Boston College is rolling out their backup quarterback again. So it'll be over for me, but I won't touch it until I have a confirmed injury report for Castellanos. Next game. Next up, we got Pitt on the road in North Carolina. UNC catching 2.5 points at home. Total sitting at 63.5, pretty much across the board here. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to this data, action coming in heavily on the Pittsburgh side. Over 60% of the tickets, almost 80% of the money. So no question, according to this data, action coming in on the Panthers, but as I always say, take it with a grain of salt. So what do we think about this matchup? Well, to be honest, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this game because I still cannot make sense of this Pittsburgh offense. 21st in the country in yards per play, 12th in success rate, 9th in PPA. I don't really get it. Entering the season, I didn't even know Holstein was going to be the quarterback. I thought it was going to be Nate Yarnell. They announced Holstein's going to play, and this dude looks like Andrew Luck out there. I mean, he's playing his ass off. In their 3 games against FBS opponents so far, they're averaging over 40 points per game. 6.98 yards per play. This is looking like one of the best offenses in the ACC, which is just so far off from what I was expecting this year. Look at Holstein's numbers. Almost 1,200 yards passing already, 9.2 yards per attempt, 12 touchdowns, 2 picks. He's matched up against a North Carolina offense that has been getting beat through the air. Against their 4 FBS opponents, they're allowing 8.75 yards per attempt. So, I mean, on paper, based on what we've seen so far, Holstein should have another big game throwing the ball, but I've been so wrong about this Pittsburgh offense. Can they continue to operate at this level? Can Holstein continue to operate at this level? I don't know. So we'll talk about this one on the live show. Maybe over, I don't know. We'll talk about it on the live show. Just a pass for now. Next up, we're back in the Big Ten. It's Iowa, Ohio State. I already recorded a handicap for this video earlier in the week. Here it is. All right, like I said, we got the Hawkeyes on the road here. Ohio State laying 19.5 or 20 or 20.5, depending on your sportsbook. Line's been bouncing around a little bit. Total sitting at 44.5. Here are the pie charts according to this data that I don't trust. Action's coming in on Iowa. Over 65% of the tickets, over 75% of the money. But as I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup, and we'll start with the Iowa offense, the new Iowa offense. Brian Ferentz is obviously gone. They've been running the ball a lot. 12th in run frequency on the season, and they've been doing a good job of it. They're actually 10th in the country in yards per carry, 36th in success rate, 21st in effective rush. Keep in mind, this Iowa team has seen Iowa State and Minnesota. That's two very legitimate defenses, and they were still able to run the ball. So this Iowa rushing attack might be a problem. But first, let's talk about the passing numbers, or the lack thereof. Look at the bottom part of this graphic, 129th in yards per pass attempt, 123rd in effective pass. The crazy part is that's actually an improvement because they were 134th last season. So I guess shout out to Iowa for jumping 11 spots from 134 to 123 in terms of a passing attack. The season started off with so much promise, right? I mean, Cade McNamara came out. It was against Illinois State, I think, but he made some throws, and Iowa put up a big number in the second half, and we were all like, whoa, look out, Iowa might be able to throw the ball this year. Since then, it's been a struggle. In the last 3 games since that one, Iowa's averaging just 113 passing yards per game, 4.7 yards per attempt. So, look, as far as running the ball, thumbs up for Iowa. But passing the ball, not so much. It's looking like the same old Iowa in terms of passing attack. And you're crazy if you think this team's going to throw the ball on the road in Columbus, because this Ohio State defense is a problem. They're 8th in DFEI, 2nd in the country in yards per play allowed, 9th in success rate, 1st in PPA. Been elite against the run, elite against the pass. They're allowing just 6.8 points per game, 23.7% opponent success rate on defense. That is wild. That's video game numbers. Ohio State's defense looks like a problem. That being said, we got to question the strength of schedule a little bit. We did see Aiden Childs play Ohio State last week, and it was the first time Ohio State has seen any sort of offensive talent this year. They've had a very easy schedule so far. They finally see a quarterback who can play. Granted, it's a freshman. He did make some plays. Aiden Childs was 13 of 19, 167 yards, a touchdown, a pick, 149 passer rating. I mean, he didn't have a great game, but a 149 passer rating against Ohio State, I mean, he was able to be somewhat effective. That being said, Aiden Childs is a lot more talented than Cade McNamara, and I'm a little worried about these numbers right here. The pass rush. Ohio State, 17th in pass rush grade, 2nd in sack rate, 25th in pressure rate. Not that Iowa's offensive line is bad. They're sitting at 20th in pass blocking grade, 68th in sack rate allowed, 52nd in pressure rate allowed. I mean, they have played a much stronger schedule than Ohio State has. But that Ohio State pass rush is coming. And Cade McNamara has struggled when pressured. I mean, he struggled when not pressured as well. You could see QB rating, yards per attempt, take a huge dip when pressured. So I'm going to double down on this sentiment. I was going to really struggle to throw the ball here. But what about the run game? Iowa on the season is averaging over 250 rushing yards a game and almost 6 yards per carry. 48.4% rushing success rate. That is very impressive. And yeah, Ohio State's got an elite run defense. They're allowing just 1.84 yards per carry. I get it. 61.8 rushing yards allowed per game for Ohio State. But against who? According to effective rush rankings on Sharp College Football, the strongest rushing attack that Ohio has seen so far this year is Marshall at 63rd. Iowa's 21st, and they've played, as we mentioned before, a couple tough defenses here. They're 10th in the country in yards per carry. We just saw them go on the road to Minnesota, a defense we know to be good. That's a tough defensive front. They averaged 6 yards per carry in the game, 272 yards rushing. They ran the ball all over Minnesota in Minnesota. So look, I'm not saying Iowa's going to go on the road into Columbus and light the scoreboard up. Of course not. That's crazy. But don't be surprised if Iowa's able to move the chains here and there on the ground. This is a very good rushing attack that's seen some very tough defenses. So I actually expect Iowa to get the run game working a little bit here. But what about the other side? The Ohio State offense been pretty balanced so far. 76th in run frequency, 59th in pass frequency. Will Howard's been great. 1039 passing yards, 9.9 yards per attempt, 8 touchdowns, 2 picks. But again, we have to ask, against who? I mean, look at Ohio State's opponents so far. These are their DFEI ratings. Akron 130th, Western Michigan 122nd, Marshall 73rd, Michigan State 49th. Michigan State's defense has actually been a little bit surprising. They've got a couple good linebackers there. They look pretty good, but none of those teams are comparable to Iowa's defense. This is one of the best defenses in the country. They're 7th in DFEI, elite against the run, 10th in yards per carry, 3rd in effective rush. I mean, Iowa has 2 of the best linebackers in the country on the inside there. So this is an elite defense, about as good as it gets when it comes to defense in the FBS. Now, to me, this matchup between Ohio State's offense and Iowa's defense comes down to the passing attack. Because Iowa, in terms of defensive front, stopping the run, it's as good as it gets in the FBS. But we have seen some teams throw the ball in Iowa a little bit. I mean, 6.7 yards per pass attempt allowed, 210.8 passing yards per game allowed. I mean, 33.4 success rate is still elite for Iowa's defense. This is obviously a great pass defense. But we've seen, I mean, we saw Rocco Beck making some plays in the Iowa State game in the second half. So they are capable of getting beat through the air. The question is, are they going to be able to pressure Will Howard? Because when Will Howard has a clean pocket, he makes you pay for it. You can see in this graphic right here, when pressured, QB rating takes a dip, yards per pass attempt takes a dip. So can Iowa get pressure here? And I'm not sure. I mean, Iowa's defense, in terms of stopping the run, I'm all in. You have my support. But in terms of a pass rush, I mean, they're 25th in sack rate, but just 75th in pressure rate generated, 67th in pass rush win rate. Ohio State's offensive line is obviously great. Great in creating space in the rushing attack, great in pass protection. So I don't know if we can count on Iowa's pass rush getting there, which means Will Howard is going to have opportunities to make plays with his arm. Here's the thing. What happened last time we saw Will Howard go up against an elite defense? It was week 14 last year against Iowa State. 24-48, 288 yards, a touchdown, a pick, and a 103 passer rating. He really struggled. Now, to be fair to Will Howard, we've definitely seen him have big games against elite defenses before. I mean, he played great in the Texas game last year. So I'm not saying, oh, Will Howard can't perform against elite defenses. But I will say, we've also seen Will Howard really struggle against elite defenses. So, look, Will Howard's going to have opportunities. Can he make the plays or not? You use your judgment. In terms of running the football, though, obviously, Ohio State on the season is averaging over 7 yards per carry. It's been unstoppable. But they finally see a defense that's somewhat decent. I mean, Michigan State's not a great defense. They're not terrible. 5.29 yards per carry. So we already see the numbers start coming back down to earth now that they're starting to see some defenses. This is Iowa. This is probably the best run defense in the country. 2.41 yards per carry allowed, just 62 rushing yards allowed per game this season. Elite. And unlike Ohio State, Iowa's played some tough games already. On the road in Minnesota, they also played Iowa State. In those two games, 2.45 yards per carry allowed, 51.5 rushing yards per game allowed. So like I said earlier, when it comes to Iowa's run defense, I'm in. It's impressive. I can trust it, which is why I took the points here. I took Iowa plus 20.5. Will Howard will have opportunities to make plays with his arm. Maybe he makes them. Maybe Ohio State ends up covering the number, but I think Iowa's defense is able to make enough plays. And I also expect Iowa to be able to run the ball a little bit, maybe put some threes on the board. I also like the under in this game, but the bet I placed, Iowa plus 20.5. So yeah, I'm on the Hawkeyes at 20.5. It's now down to 18.5. I mean, that would still be my pick. Anything over 17, I would go with Iowa. Obviously, don't like it as much under 20, but yeah, I think Iowa's able to play him tough. So yeah, Iowa's still the pick for me. Next up, we got Indiana on the road at Northwestern. This line is at 13.5. Total sitting at 41. I see a couple 41.5s as well. So pretty low total here, which makes sense for a Northwestern game. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to this data, action's coming in heavily on the Indiana side. Over 70% of the tickets, over 90% of the money, which makes sense. Indiana's looked really impressive so far. So what do we think of this matchup? Well, you look at Indiana's offense. Holy shit, man. 15th in OFEI, 19th in yards per play. They've been great running the ball. They've been great throwing the ball. Definitely been leaning on the run a little bit, but that could be because they've been up on the scoreboard in mostly all of their games. They're 44th in run frequency. Again, that could have been because of the score of their games. Now, here's what I don't like about this matchup for Indiana. Nobody is running the ball on Northwestern. Look at their numbers from their 3 home games this year. This is against Duke, Eastern Illinois, okay, FCS school, and Washington. Washington's looked like a pretty good offense so far. They're allowing just 57.7 rushing yards per game, 2.34 yards per carry, 31% success rate. Nobody is coming into this stadium and running the ball on Northwestern. Keep in mind, this is a Northwestern defense that brought back 7 of their top 8 defensive linemen. I said entering the season, I expected Northwestern's defense to be greatly improved this year. So far as the defensive front goes, it's looking like I was pretty correct on that. And yeah, up to this point, Indiana's been bulldozing every single team they've seen. They've only played 1 road game. It was at UCLA. They didn't really run all over UCLA. Now they beat the hell out of them. UCLA's offense is so terrible. They average just 4.24 yards per carry, 123 rushing yards in the game. I don't think they're going to be able to run the ball in this one. I think Curtis Rourke is going to have to win this game making plays with his arm in windy-ass Chicago. This is arguably the best defense he's seen so far this year. On the road, I think Indiana's offense might struggle for the first time this year. Now, on the other side of the ball, I mean, Northwestern's offense looks terrible. Mike Wright really struggling. They have maybe a little bit of a rushing attack, and that's something I will say in terms of Indiana's defense. Yeah, the numbers look great. Look at the effective rush rating. 83rd. That's schedule adjusted. Want to know why it says 83rd? They haven't played a single decent run game yet. And I'm not saying Northwestern is a decent run game, but they're not practical joke terrible. They can run the ball a bit at times. Look, I'm getting sidetracked here. I'm not trying to say Northwestern's going to move the ball up and down the field on Indiana. Not saying that. Northwestern's offense looks pretty bad, but I think they will be able to run the ball a little bit. That being said, I think Indiana's offense is going to struggle more than we've seen them struggle so far this year, and they should not be laying 2 touchdowns on the road. I'm on the Wildcats here. Northwestern took it at plus 13.5 next game. Next up, we got Virginia Tech on the road at Stanford. This line is down to 7.5. I still see 8s and 8.5, so anywhere in between 7.5 and 8.5. Total sitting at 50.5 or 50, depending on your sports book. Take a quick look at the pie charts, and according to this data, public action's coming in pretty split. 52% of the tickets on Virginia Tech. Money actually leaning towards Stanford, though. 65% of the money, according to this data, that you should take with a grain of salt. So Virginia Tech plays a great game against Miami, coming off the heartbreak loss. What do we think about this matchup here against Stanford? Well, straight up, I don't like it. Virginia Tech, as we know, this is an offense that needs to run the ball. Kyron Drones still developing as a passer. They need to run the ball. They're 31st in yards per carry, 69th in success rate, 29th in effective rush. Now, the good news for Virginia Tech is it looks like they're finally getting their shit together. I mean, after a slow start to the season, for most of that Miami game, they looked like the Virginia Tech we were expecting to see entering the year. Here's the thing. Stanford's defense is surprisingly looking good against the run. 33rd in the country in yards per carry allowed, 59th in success rate, 70th in effective rush. Look at Stanford's defensive numbers against the run in the 3 games other than the Clemson game. Obviously, Clemson ran the ball on them. They would run the ball on anybody. But look at their numbers in their other 3 games. Just 51.7 rushing yards allowed per game, 2.18. So Stanford might have a decent run defense here. Yes, they're definitely vulnerable against the pass, but do you trust Kyron Drones to fly across the country coming off the heartbreak loss and cover more than a touchdown with his arm? I mean, look at the Virginia Tech passing numbers from the last 4 games. Just 157.8 passing yards per game, 5.9 yards per attempt, 34.2% success rate per dropback. That's terrible. This has not been a good passing offense. So Stanford having a pretty solid run defense, or what looks to be a pretty solid run defense, that's a problem for Virginia Tech going on the road. Now, on the other side of the ball, no question, Virginia Tech's defense definitely has the advantage here. 52nd in DFEI compared to 95th in OFEI for Stanford's offense. Virginia Tech's defense is better than Stanford's offense. But what are the 2 games where we saw Virginia Tech's defense struggle the most? The Miami game and the Vanderbilt game. They allowed 36 points per game in those 2, 6.53 yards per play, 47% success rate. Now, why are these 2 games significant? Those are the 2 games they've played against offenses with dual threat quarterbacks. Cam Ward in Miami, Diego Pavia in Vanderbilt. Ashton Daniels is most definitely a dual threat quarterback. He's a great athlete. The Hokies defense has shown us they struggle against these types of quarterbacks, so maybe Ashton Daniels is able to make plays. I don't know. As a whole, I don't trust Stanford's offense to consistently move the ball, but it definitely scares me enough for me to not lay the 7.5, 8 points with Virginia Tech here. I also don't love the spot coming from Miami, the heartbreak loss, and then flying all the way across the country. I understand that Stanford also flew across the country, but they got their asses beat by Clemson. I don't know. It'll be Stanford or pass. The market seems to agree with me. This number's been bought down a little bit. So Stanford or pass. I don't have a bet on this game currently. By the time you're watching this, I may have placed a bet on Stanford. You can always check the website under open bets to see if I have. Also, we'll talk about it on the live show again. So I'll let you know on the live show. Next up is Auburn, Georgia. We're going down to the SEC. This one is in Athens, Georgia, laying 22.5. I see a 21.5 too. So lines anywhere in between 21.5, 22.5. Total sitting at 51.5 or 52, depending on your sports book. We actually talked about this one on the live show. Andy's a diehard Georgia fan, so I'm just going to put that in here. Listen to what he has to say.
I don't think they're going to cover this. I will say this. This is kind of a classic. Everybody assumes Georgia's going to wake up after that second half they had, which they almost came back and won. That was great. everybody assumes they're just going to carry into that. Look, I think there's some legit issues with this team. They can't run the ball. I mean, that's been obvious. Their last 2 games, they haven't been able to run for anything. Right now, Trevor Etienne looks like a fraud. No offense. Not to be mean. He looks as fake as could possibly be. He can't get anything right now, and that's against 2 SEC defenses in Kentucky and Alabama. Look, Auburn's got a good run defense. They have a good run defense, so we all know that. So, okay, Georgia's not going to be able to run the ball. Well, is Carson Beck going to throw all over them like he did in the second half against Alabama? Because we know Alabama, but I don't necessarily think he will, because I think Auburn's got a pretty decent defense overall. Their pass defense is fine. I don't think that they're going to blow out Auburn as easily as people think. Another thing about Georgia, they have started about as slow as you possibly could in almost every game this year besides the Tennessee Tech game. They scored 6 points in the first half against Clemson. They scored 6 points in the first half against Kentucky, or 7 points. And then they were getting blown out immediately in that game against Alabama. They scored 7 points in the first half. They haven't scored double digits in a first half this year. In order to cover a number like this, you're going to have to score a lot of points early. And I just don't think that seems like a legit issue. So there's clear issues here for Georgia. I don't care that this game is at home. Usually Georgia does play well at home, but there's just real issues here for them blowing out a team. I know Auburn's bad. Don't get me wrong. Auburn's an awful football team.
It sounds like you don't know that Auburn's bad.
No,
Auburn's
you're about to
bad.
Find out. Auburn's bad, but I think that that they're gonna play. They're gonna play Georgia tough. Georgia's gonna get their best game, and I think it's gonna be closer than people think. Now, do I think it's gonna be like a touchdown game? No, I think Georgia probably wins this by 2 touchdowns, but 24.5 is a high number in a rivalry game like this.
Yeah, I think the exact opposite of what you just said is going to happen. I would take Georgia first quarter -6.5, Georgia first half -13.5. I mean, read the comments. Yeah, like you heard me say at the end there, I personally think Georgia beats the hell out of them. Peyton Thorne may throw 4 pick sixes. It would only be Georgia. Market seems to be betting this number down. It was at 24.5. I'm seeing at 21.5 now. So I don't know. I don't have a bet on this game. We'll talk about it on the live show. It'll be maybe Georgia first half for pass. Next up, Big 12. We got West Virginia on the road at Oklahoma State. Pokes are laying 3 points at home. Total sitting at 64.5 for this one. Let's take a look at the pie charts. And according to this data, action's coming in on the Oklahoma State side. About 60% of the tickets and about 60% of the money on Oklahoma State, according to this data. So what do we think about this matchup? Well, West Virginia's offense, we were expecting, or I should say I was expecting, this top 10, top 15 dynamic rushing attack this year. And it's not that the rushing attack has been bad. Definitely been a little bit disappointing. They're just 86th in the country in yards per carry, 30th in success rate. They are still rated 24th in effective rush, but definitely not quite what I was expecting. I mean, look at their rushing numbers in their 3 FBS games. Penn State's understandable. Kansas defense is okay. Pitt's defense is okay, but just 3.7 yards per carry in their 3 FBS games. We were expecting this to be one, or I should say I was expecting this to be one of the best rushing offenses in the country, and they just haven't looked like that. To be honest, I really don't even know how I feel about this game. I've lost bets on both of these. I took Oklahoma State last week against Kansas State. Wasn't even close. I lost a big bet against West Virginia, and I lost a big bet with West Virginia this year. So I don't know if I'm seeing these teams clearly. So we'll talk about this game on the live show. As of right now, I got nothing. Next up, we got RU Nebraska. Big game for Rutgers here. I already uploaded a video on this, so here it is. All right, like I said, Scarlet Knights on the road in Lincoln. Nebraska laying a full touchdown here. There are a couple 6.5s out there if you look. So 6.5 or 7, depending on your sportsbook. Total sitting at 40.5 or 41, depending on your sportsbook. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to these numbers, action coming in on the Nebraska side, over 65% of the tickets, about 55% of the money on Nebraska. Again, as I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup. We'll start with some head-to-head history. Nebraska kind of owns Rutgers here. They've beaten them 5 in a row, but Scarlet Knights have covered. 3-2 against the spread. Rutgers is against Nebraska in their last 5 matchups. But obviously, this is a completely new Rutgers team and a completely new Nebraska team with Matt Rule. So this is pretty much irrelevant. Just thought it was interesting enough to include. So let's get into this matchup. Rutgers offense, obviously led by the rushing attack, 11th in the country in run frequency. This is an offense that wants to run the ball, and they've been pretty damn good at it. 42nd in yards per carry, 25th in rushing success rate, 14th in effective rush. Now, you might notice that their passing numbers look pretty good. 25th in yards per pass attempt, 19th in success rate per drop back. But look at the effective pass, 79th And when you look at and I'll show you why it's that in a second. If you look at Kaliakmanis' numbers, you might be like, hey, he's playing pretty well. 761 yards on the season, 7.9 yards per attempt, 7 touchdowns, 1 interception. Okay, so why are they 79th in effective pass? Well, because he did all of his damage against Howard and Akron. I mean, look at his last 2 games. Just 192 passing yards per game, 7.8 yards per attempt. 46% success rate per dropback is actually pretty good. But the point is, once Rutgers saw a couple of Power 4 defenses, I mean, they saw Virginia Tech, who doesn't even have the greatest defense, and then Washington, who doesn't even have the greatest defense. Once they saw a couple of legitimate programs, the passing numbers, Kaliakmanis started to struggle. He did all of his damage against Howard and Akron in the first 2 weeks of the season. We know this is a Rutgers offense that needs to run the football to be successful. So will they be able to do it against Nebraska? It's tough to say. I mean, Nebraska's got great run defense numbers on paper, 6th in yards per carry allowed. 71st in success rate isn't very good. 24th in effective rush, so some advanced metrics have them as a top 25 run defense. The defense as a whole sitting at 23rd in DFEI, so pretty solid here. One thing we did learn about the Nebraska defense in the Illinois game, if their pass rush isn't able to get home, their secondary is very beatable. Luke Altmyer showed us that. 21 of 27, 215 yards, 4 touchdowns, 193.6 passer rating. Altmyer had time to throw in that game, and he picked Nebraska's secondary apart. Now, a couple things to consider. One, Kaliakmanis is most definitely not Luke Altmyer. I'm big on Altmyer. I think he's a very good Big Ten quarterback, definitely underrated. I bet Illinois in this Nebraska game, bet them again against Penn State last week. So personally, I'm an Altmyer fan. Kaliakmanis is most definitely not Altmyer, but also Rutgers' offensive line is not on the level of Illinois' offensive line either. I was just referencing Nebraska's pass rush. This is a top 25 unit. I mean, 16th in pass rush grade, 29th in pressure rate. It's a very good pass rush. Not that Rutgers' offensive line is bad. In fact, it's a pretty formidable Rutgers offensive line, but it's not Illinois. They're 54th in pass blocking grade, 71st in sack rate. They're 20th in pressure rate and 7th in hurry rate. So you might be like, hey, they've been doing a great job in pass protection. But, I mean, against who? Howard? Akron? Virginia Tech's offense, if you stop that offense, that's impressive, but Virginia Tech's defense isn't anything special. Washington's, I mean, that's not a crazy defensive front. So Rutgers' offensive line has performed well up to this point. This will be by far their toughest test, the Nebraska defensive front. So personally, I know Kaliakmanis has some decent looking numbers on the year. I think he's going to be in hell on this one. I think that Nebraska pass rush is going to win their battles and going to be all over them. I don't expect Rutgers to be able to throw the ball in this game. Now, what about running the football? Because like I said, this is what Rutgers wants to do, and they're good at it. 237.8 rushing yards per game, 5.43 yards per carry, almost a 50% success rate when they hand the ball off. That's very impressive. I definitely don't love the fact that Monangai struggled a little bit in his only road game. On the road, week 3, Virginia Tech, 3.2 yards per carry. Other than that, he's been steamrolling everybody. But as a whole, we know this is a very dangerous Rutgers rushing attack. So will they be able to run on Nebraska? I think so, a little bit. I mean, if you look at Nebraska's run defense numbers on the season, they look elite. 2.89 yards per carry allowed so far. 87.4 rushing yards allowed per game so far. So it looks great. Surface level numbers, Nebraska has an elite run defense. But against who? I mean, if you go by their effective rush ratings, the strongest rushing attack that Nebraska's seen so far this year is Illinois, sitting at 51st. Illinois is a passing offense. And by the way, Illinois ran the ball a little bit in that game. They averaged 4.3 yards per carry. So, I mean, they haven't really seen any decent rushing attacks this season. And Illinois, who's not even a strong rushing attack, was able to run the ball on them. Rutgers is sitting at 14th in effective rush. So this is going to be the strongest rushing attack Nebraska's seen this year by a landslide. Unfortunately, though, like I said, I don't trust Kaliakmanis on the road in Lincoln here. So Rutgers' offense is definitely going to be a little bit one-dimensional in this game. I mentioned Illinois was able to run the ball on Nebraska. That's because Nebraska had to respect Altmyer. They don't really have to respect Kaliakmanis. So I think it's going to be a struggle for Rutgers offensively. Even though on paper they should be able to run the ball in Nebraska, I don't think we can count on it. On the other side, we got the Nebraska offense, and they've been pretty balanced. To be honest, not really the offense I was expecting from Nebraska. They're 71st in run frequency, 64th in pass frequency. If you look at their metrics on the season, I was expecting Nebraska to really lean on their run game this year. They brought in a couple really big physical backs. They have a good offensive line. So far, 76th in yards per carry, 81st in effective rush. In fact, the strongest part of Nebraska's offense has been Raiola. 39th in yards per pass attempt, 20th in success rate, 34th in effective pass. They're sitting at 48th in OFEI. I wasn't expecting this. I was expecting Matt Rule to run the football and let Raiola develop as a freshman. Unfortunately, the run game hasn't really been there like they expected it to be. So Raiola's had to develop faster than they probably wanted him to. But the thing is, he looks really good. 1,221 yards, 8.5 yards per attempt, 9 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He's actually been great protecting the football. A+ turnover-worthy play rate. I also really like how he seems to be improving as the season's progressing. In the first 2 games, Nebraska was only averaging 234.5 passing yards per game, just over 7 yards per attempt. Look at the last 3 games since then. 274 passing yards per game, almost 10 yards per attempt, 57.2% passing success rate per dropback. So in the last 3 games, Raiola really turning it on. And this Nebraska offense, didn't think we'd be saying it this year, maybe next year in his sophomore year, but I'm going to say it. This is a pretty good passing attack here. So how does that match up against the Rutgers defense? Well, I mean, this Rutgers defense is a tough one to get a feel for. If you look at their numbers, this is an elite pass defense and a terrible run defense. And I guess that's a decent summary of how they look so far this year. I mean, they're 133rd in yards per carry on the season, 120th in success rate against the run. You got to remember, this is a Rutgers defense that lost its middle linebacker, defensive captain, leading tackler, like their main defensive piece. They lost them for the year right before the season started. So it's not crazy to think that Rutgers is terrible against the run, and that's what it's looked like so far. But I do kind of question the Rutgers pass defense numbers. I mean, they look great. 27th in yards per pass attempt, 15th in success rate, 19th in effective pass. But in the first 3 games, they were allowing just 134 passing yards per game, 4.7 yards per attempt. They looked elite. They were looking like an elite pass rush. They shut down drones at Virginia Tech. Rutgers was looking like a top 10 pass defense. But then Washington did whatever they want. I mean, I can't believe Washington only scored 18 points in that game. There was a lot of penalties. A lot of things bounced Rutgers' way. I mean, look at the passing offense for Washington. 314 yards, 8.5 yards per attempt, over a 47% success rate per dropback. Washington ran the ball on Rutgers, too. So Rutgers' defense had no answers for Washington. How are they going to stop Nebraska in Lincoln? I mean, this Rutgers defensive front doesn't look great. They're getting bullied off the line of scrimmage, 111th in line yards. They're not really generating a pass rush, 82nd in pressure rate, 121st in sack rate. Nebraska's offensive line's been pretty good. I mean, not elite. Certainly better than Rutgers' defensive front, though. Now, I know when we're talking about Nebraska's offense, everyone's going to point at that Illinois game. They only had 48 yards rushing in the game, 1.5 yards per carry, something crazy like that. Couldn't run the ball at all on Illinois. But here's the thing. Rutgers' run defense looks really bad, and that defensive front is really struggling. There was some magic on Rutgers' side to win that Washington game. I watched the whole thing, rooting for Rutgers. I think the fairy dust runs out here in Lincoln. So even though I'm not all in on this Nebraska team, Rutgers is really due to lay an egg, and I think Nebraska probably wins this comfortably. I cannot bet this. I'm in New Jersey. I'm not legally allowed to bet this game. There's 6.5s open. I would grab them. I'd be on Nebraska minus 6.5 if I was able to bet it. Yeah, like I said in the video, it would only be Nebraska, but I'm not legally allowed to bet it. So I'll be watching the game. Let's go Rutgers. But if I was able to bet the game, and if I was forced to pick a side, it would be Nebraska minus the points. Next up, we got Miami of Ohio, Toledo. What do we got for this one? Toledo laying 6.5 points at home. Total sitting at 43.5 or 44, depending on your sports book. Take a look at the pie charts, and according to this data, we have a pros versus public game. Public action coming in heavy on Toledo. Sharp action coming in heavy on Miami of Ohio. But as I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. We actually talked about this game on the live show. Andy likes this one, so I'll let you listen to what he has to say.
Yeah, I bet this one, that game against Massachusetts, a little bit fluky, I will say. It was raining, but also there was a play. Tyson Pomachan, the quarterback for UMass, who I thought was going to be really good coming into the year, had a really bad year so far. He didn't play well on Saturday, although his stats look a little bit better than he actually did. He went 9 of 22, 173 yards passing. 64 yards of that was on one play. It was on a 3rd and 12, 64-yard touchdown pass. It was raining, like I said. It looked like the corner slipped a little bit. That's one of those fluky things you can't control. It was a close game all around. Miami of Ohio, they're not going to really beat up on teams anyway. They don't have that type of offense, so I'm not surprised they didn't cover. But then coming into this, I mean, you have a team coming off a bye in Toledo after a tough loss to Western Kentucky, so they should be rested, but again, that's still in their head. They lost the game after beating Mississippi State, so that was a huge letdown for them. And now you have Miami of Ohio, who was picked to win this conference. This is their MAC opener now. They've had about as brutal of a schedule as you could imagine for a team in the MAC. They started off with Northwestern, which isn't obviously isn't a good team, but
No, Northwestern's got a good
yeah,
defensive front.
they're
though.
much better than Miami of Ohio. Then they went on the road and they played Cincinnati. Well, they were on the road anyway. They played Cincinnati, and then they went to go play Notre Dame. So those are 3 brutal starts to the season, and they actually held their own pretty well in terms of on defense. They played pretty well overall. They got ran all over by Cincinnati and Notre Dame, but none of those teams threw on them, and that's important here because I think that their run defense is much better than that, right? They just only gave up 4.5 yards per carry to UMass. That was a much better game for them. And Toledo wants to run it. So, I mean, that's how they want to play. They want to run the ball. They weren't able to run on Western Kentucky, and it kind of screwed them a little bit. And so, yeah, I think they're not going to be able to run the ball as well here compared to their other games this year. Miami of Ohio overall just played much better defense. They were picked to win this conference. Like I said, they were the number 1 team coming into the season, and now they're starting MAC play. So this is where their season pretty much starts. We know Gabbert is a hell of a lot better when he plays MAC schools than when he plays, UMass, Notre Dame, Cincinnati, those non-conference games that don't mean much. So I'm basically just banking on the fact coming into the season, we all thought Miami of Ohio was the best team. Toledo was picked toward the bottom of this conference. So like talent,
Northern Illinois.
I also thought Bowling Green was better than Miami of Ohio,
Yeah,
but
true.
one of the top 3 teams in the conference. And Toledo was picked second to last behind Akron. So like there were or in front of Akron. So a lot of people assume that this team's just going to be just come in and been great because they beat Mississippi State. I don't buy it. Mississippi State looks awful. So yeah, I'm just banking on. I do think Miami of Ohio is a very good team.
As for me, I completely agree with them. I think Miami of Ohio is every bit as good as Toledo. In fact, I think you could make the strong argument that they're the better team. They played a ridiculous schedule. So, yeah, in my opinion, this line's off. I agree with them. It would be Miami of Ohio plus the points here. Next game. Clemson on the road at Florida State. God help me talking Florida State football again. This line's looking like 14 and a half. I see a 15 and a half. Florida State, big home dog here. Total sitting at pretty much 46 and a half across the board. Let's take a look at the pie charts. According to this data, action's coming in heavily on the Clemson side, as it should if you've watched Florida State play football this year. Over 70% of the tickets on Clemson, 65% of the money on Clemson as well. So what do we think of this matchup? Well, this one will be quick. Clemson's offense looks electric. 14th in the country in yards per play, 8th in yards per carry, 29th in yards per pass attempt. They're currently sitting at 11th in OFEI, and that's including the Georgia game. Look at what this offense has been doing since the Georgia game, since the opener in week 1. They're averaging 55 points per game. 55. 8.16 yards per play. They're averaging over 8 yards per play for the last 3 games. That's absolutely crazy. And Florida State, for a few weeks there, it was looking like the offense was the problem and the defense was actually okay. But, I mean, even their defense is falling apart. In their last 2 games, look at their pass defense. Over 278 passing yards allowed per game. This is against Cal and SMU. 9.6 yards per pass attempt against Cal and SMU. I know they won the game against Cal 14-9. Mendoza still threw for over 300 yards in the game. So, I mean, on paper, Clemson should do literally whatever they want against Florida State's defense. And on the other side of the ball, I mean, Florida State's offense is terrible. I know DJU is hurt. Maybe a new quarterback brings some energy. I don't know. They look terrible across the board. Honestly, everyone's blaming DJU because that's just how football goes. Everyone gives the credit to the quarterback or they blame the quarterback. But this offense is broken top to bottom. The offensive line looks terrible, dropping passes left and right. So I'm not sure how much a new quarterback does. And these Clemson defensive numbers, these are not legitimate. Look at the schedule adjusted numbers. 30th in effective rush, 21st in effective pass. The reason that is, they were up 42-0 on Appalachian State. App State scored 20 points in garbage time. Then they were up 52-7 on NC State. NC State still scored 35 points in the game in garbage time against their second unit. So if you look at the yards per carry, yards per play, doesn't really tell the whole story. This Clemson defense looks good as shit. So yeah, as far as betting this game, it would only be Clemson for me here. I haven't bet it yet. I mean, the case you could make for the Florida State side is it's a rivalry game. They do have talent. Maybe they get up for this one. I don't know. Based on what we've seen, I don't know how you could bet Florida State here. Next game. Next up, we got SEC, Tennessee, Arkansas. I already recorded a video on this game, so here it is. All right, like I said, we got Tennessee on the road at Arkansas here. Hogs are catching points at home. Looks like plus 13.5 pretty much across the board. Total sitting at 60 and a half. I actually see a 59 and a half too. So hovering around 60 for the total. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to this data that I don't trust, action's coming in heavy on the Tennessee side, and that makes sense. I mean, the Vols definitely looking pretty impressive so far. Over 75% of the tickets, over 50% of the money. So actually, according to this data, there's some sharp action in on the Arkansas side. Again, as I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. So let's match these two teams up, and we'll start with the Tennessee offense. Heavy dose of the run game, 5th in run frequency. Now, that could be a result of being up 40 points in a lot of their football games, but definitely seen a lot of running out of Tennessee so far. Obviously, they started the season off with 3 straight blowout wins. They were averaging 63.7 points per game in their first 3 games. Absolutely crazy. Over 8 yards per play, almost a 55% success rate. Obviously, it wasn't the strongest of competition, but we did see this Tennessee offense get tested in their last game. They went on the road into Norman. Oklahoma's got a really tough defense this year. And, I mean, I don't want to say they struggled because they did win comfortably, but the offense wasn't humming. They scored 25 points in the game, but averaged just 4.73 points per play, just a 31.5% success rate. So no question, Oklahoma's defense was able to give Tennessee's offense some problems. Now, if we pull up Tennessee's offensive numbers on the season, obviously they're elite looking. They're sitting at 17th in OFEI. I mean, look at the passing numbers. 7th in yards per pass attempt, 4th in success rate, just 59th in effective pass because, I mean, if you look at their strength of schedule, really haven't been tested, and they also haven't been throwing the ball a lot. But no question, this is a high-powered offense with a ton of talent. If you look at Nico's numbers, it's off to a hell of a start to a career. 892 passing yards, over 10 yards per attempt. Dude is delivering the ball downfield, making plays. 7 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Turnover-worthy play rate sitting at C+. So definitely needs to put the ball in harm's way a bit less. But as a whole, I mean, he has lived up to the hype so far. Look at the passing numbers in the first 3 games, averaging 303 passing yards per game, 10 yards per pass attempt, almost a 60% success rate per dropback. Yeah, he was looking pretty good. And even in the Oklahoma game where we saw his numbers come down, he only threw for 194 yards in the Oklahoma game. He was still making plays. Averaged 9.2 yards per attempt in that game. I was actually surprised. I had the under in that game. He was a lot better on the road in Norman than I expected him to be. I expected him to really struggle. He didn't. I mean, my under cashed, so I was happy with the result. But I was really impressed with what I saw from him on the road in Norman. No question, he made some plays, and he was put in some tough spots in that game. So how does this Tennessee offense match up against Arkansas's defense? Well, we do have to give the Hogs some credit. I mean, defensively, this is much better than I expected to see this year. They're sitting at 41st in DFEI. Look at their numbers against the run. 41st in yards per carry, 24th in success rate, 19th in effective rush. And Arkansas has played some teams. It's not like they've played nobody. Yes, they've definitely struggled against the pass a bit, but as a whole, I got to give Sam Pittman and this Arkansas defense some credit. Definitely way better than I was expecting. The main question in this matchup, though, in my opinion, are they able to pressure Nico? Can they generate pressure against this Tennessee offensive line? Because that has been his weakness so far, and this isn't a knock on him. That's to be expected with a freshman quarterback. Definitely struggling when pressured. QB rating takes a huge hit. Yards per attempt takes a huge hit. If you pressure Nico, Oklahoma showed us, if you get pressure on Nico, you can give this Tennessee offense some problems. So can Arkansas generate pressure on Nico? And the answer is probably not. I mean, they're 87th in pressure rate, 105th in sack rate, 110th in pass rush grade. As we know, this Tennessee offensive line is pretty good. It's not up there with the likes of Georgia and LSU and Ole Miss, but it's a small step down. They're 47th in pass blocking grade, 25th in pressure rate allowed so far. But you know what? Oklahoma was the first real test for this Tennessee offensive line. So maybe now seeing a defense like Arkansas that's better than we expected it to be, maybe we see that this Tennessee offensive line isn't as good as we think. I mean, there's a lot of maybes and ifs in that sentence, but we do have to acknowledge that Oklahoma was Tennessee's offensive line first test, and we saw Oklahoma generate some pressure on Nico. The problem with that hypothetical is, although Arkansas's defense has wowed us a bit and has been a little better than expected, they're still not Oklahoma's defense. I mean, Brent Venables really built himself a good defense out there in Oklahoma. Arkansas is not Oklahoma. So I personally don't think they're going to be able to generate pressure on Nico, but we'll wait and see. But what about stopping the run? Because we mentioned before, I mean, we're sitting here talking about Nico and Arkansas generating pressure. What we need to be talking about is right here, Tennessee's 5th in run frequency. They're going to try to run the ball. In the first 3 games of the season, they were averaging damn near 7 yards per carry, 336 rushing yards per game. They were running the ball all over everybody. I mean, yes, it was some weaker competition. And yes, last week on the road in Norman, we saw that come crashing down. Oklahoma held them to just 2.9 yards per carry. 28.6% rushing success rate is not good. So can Arkansas replicate that? Well, it's really hard to say because this Arkansas run defense, although it looked really good, I mean, they shut down Ollie Gordon in Oklahoma State, although that offense looks a little broken. Look what Auburn did to him. Auburn averaged 5.62 yards per carry against Arkansas. Auburn's not a dangerous rushing attack like that. Yeah, in their other 4 games, they held their opponents to 2.68 yards per carry, 80.5 yards per game. And there's a Texas A&M game in there. That's impressive. A&M can run the ball. So we've seen Arkansas's run defense play really well, but Auburn ripped them to shreds. So personally, my opinion on this side of the ball, maybe Arkansas's defensive front shows up and is able to give Tennessee some problems, but you got Tennessee coming off the bye, coming off a huge game on the road in Norman where they saw a really tough defense, a lot tougher than the Arkansas defense. I think the run game's going to be there. I think Nico makes some plays. I personally think Arkansas is going to struggle to make stops here. But what about on the other side? What do we think about this Arkansas offense? Pretty balanced so far, 66 in rushing frequency, 69th in passing frequency. The offense has been okay, pretty average. I mean, 59th in yards per play, 25th in success rate, 39th in PPA. Pretty average passing numbers. The rushing numbers look okay. 51st in yards per carry, 9th in success rate, 35th in effective rush. I'm actually a little surprised with Taylon Green. Not that he's been electric, but I thought he was really going to struggle this year. I really didn't like what I saw from him last year at Boise State. So when he transferred to Arkansas, I was like, wow, against SEC defenses, good luck. But he's actually been making some plays. Yes, he's thrown 5 picks. He hasn't been absolutely terrible. He's been better than I thought. I thought he was really going to struggle. The first 2 games of the season, they were going off. 10 yards per pass attempt, 412 passing yards per game. I was really floored by this. I was like, wait, Arkansas is going to have a passing attack this year with Taylon Green? That doesn't even make sense. But last 2 games, they're starting to see some SEC opponents, and now we're seeing Taylon Green start to look like Taylon Green. Passing yards per game is down to 215 against Auburn and Texas A&M. That's their last 2 games. Just 6.1 yards per attempt, 31.1% success rate per dropback. So we've seen the Arkansas passing attack come crashing down now that they're starting to see some SEC defenses. And now you're going to get Tennessee's defense coming off a bye, who's probably better than both A&M and Auburn's defense. Tennessee actually leads the country in yards per play allowed, 1st in success rate, 3rd in PPA. They also lead the country in yards per carry allowed, 1st in that, 1st in run defense success rate, 6th in effective rush. This is an elite defense across the board. Granted, they haven't played the toughest of competition. Their big game was against Oklahoma. That offense has looked like ass all year. So they really haven't seen an offense yet. We do have to mention that. But Tennessee's defense thus far looks about as elite as you can get. Look at their defensive line metrics here. I mean, we're looking at top 15, top 20 numbers across the board. No one's generating push against this Tennessee defensive line. They're also 9th in pressure rate, so the pass rush has been there, looking like the Tennessee pass rush from a couple years ago. With Hooker at quarterback, that pass rush, that was a good pass rush. Looking good in that department. The reason that's significant in this matchup is Arkansas struggling in pass protection. 89th in pass blocking grade, 95th in sack rate allowed, 116th in pressure rate allowed. So that Tennessee pass rush is going to generate pressure on Taylon Green. What is he able to do with it? Now, let's give him some credit. He's actually handled pressure pretty well this year. Actually, he's got better splits when pressured. Now, better in comparison to other quarterbacks, not better numbers. This is in comparison to other quarterbacks, but still, he's not turning the ball over. He's not taking sacks, so maybe Taylon Green is able to make some plays with his legs against the Tennessee pass rush, but that's pretty thin. This is a very good defense. He's definitely going to be put into some tough situations in this game. And will he have any run support? Well, the first 3 games, Arkansas's run game looked great. They're averaging 6.6 yards per carry, 259 yards per game, almost a 60% rushing success rate. But last 2 weeks, they start seeing some SEC defenses. 3.33 yards per carry. Success rate looks good, so they've been consistent, getting 4 or 5 yards here and there, but just 141 rushing yards per game, which is way down from what we saw in the first 3 games. Want to know how Tennessee's been defending the run so far this year? Well, they're allowing 1.57 yards per carry, 1.57 on the season, just 50.8 rushing yards allowed per game. 22% success rate is crazy. So I don't know if the run game's going to be there for Arkansas. And personally, I don't trust Taylon Green to make plays on this Tennessee defense. So I would lean towards the Tennessee side, minus 13.5. The bet I would probably place here, Arkansas team total under 22.5. I think Arkansas is going to really struggle to move the ball in this game. Maybe the defense, the Arkansas defense that has been better than I expected, maybe they're able to stifle the Tennessee rushing attack a bit. Maybe Nico struggles a little bit to get it going through the air. So maybe Tennessee's offense stutters a little bit where they don't cover the full 2 touchdowns. But one thing I'm pretty confident in is Tennessee's defense is really going to give Arkansas's offense some problems. So Arkansas team total under 22.5, lean towards Tennessee minus the points in this one. Next up, we got UCF Florida in the Swamp. Gators catching 1.5 points at home. Total sitting at 62, 61.5, somewhere in there. Let's take a quick look at the pie charts, and according to this data, we're looking at a ProServe public game. Public action coming in on Central Florida, sharp action on Florida, but again, take this data with a grain of salt. So what do we think about this matchup? And look, I'm going to stick up for Florida here, and I know that sounds crazy. If you look at these run defense numbers, it looks bad, right? 91st in yards per carry allowed, 98th in success rate, 89th in effective rush. And the reason I'm isolating the run defense numbers is that's all UCF does. They are a run-first offense to the maximum. They don't have much of a passing attack, even with KJ Jefferson at quarterback. This team runs the ball. That's all they do. Run the ball to RJ Harvey. That's all they do. That's what that offense is. And if you look at Florida's run defense numbers against Texas A&M, it was bad. They allowed 310 yards on the ground, 5.64 yards per carry. It was bad. But the thing is about that Texas A&M game, we didn't even know Marcel Reed was going to be the quarterback until last minute. This might have been a bit of Florida getting caught off guard. Connor Wegman is not a scrambler. He is not a mobile quarterback. And then last minute, they announced Marcel Reed's playing quarterback, who is a mobile guy who nobody has any film on. So I think this was a bit of Florida getting completely blindsided by a quarterback they've never seen before and didn't prepare for. If you look at Florida's run defense numbers in their other 3 games, it's not bad. They're allowing just 3.59 yards per carry, 148.3 rushing yards per game. They have a very big physical defensive line. I do not think this is a terrible run defense, and that's important because obviously we mentioned all UCF does is run it. They're 7th in run frequency. This is practically a service academy. So I actually don't love the matchup for UCF's offense. I think the Gators could get them off the field and force a few punts here. Now, what about the other side of the ball? Florida's offense doesn't look bad. 39th in yards per play, 13th in success rate. Passing offense looks great. 44th in yards per pass attempt, 24th in success rate per dropback, 15th in effective pass. Look at UCF's pass defense numbers. This is a terrible pass defense. We saw what Shedeur Sanders just did to him. They're 95th in yards per pass attempt allowed, 113th in the country in success rate per dropback, 79th in effective pass. UCF has played 3 games this year against FBS opponents. They've gotten cooked through the air in all 3. In those 3, by the way, one of them was against Sam Houston State. They're allowing over 303 passing yards per game, 8.33 yards per attempt, 48% success rate per dropback. And look, I know it's fun to hate on this Florida team right now. They're in shambles. Billy Napier may get fired. But the truth is, since that Miami game, they've had a passing offense. In their last 3 games since Miami, they played Miami, then they played 3 more games. They're averaging over 330 passing yards per game, 11.7 yards per attempt, over 54% success rate per dropback. So they've been throwing the ball. Florida's problem has not been that they can't score points. It has not been that they can't throw the ball. Their problem has been they can't stop the pass. But UCF doesn't throw the ball. So I actually don't hate this matchup for Florida. As far as the market goes, there was a ton of money on UCF early. Florida actually opened up as favorites, -1.5, and UCF +1.5 just got hammered all the way up to 3. But what did we see at 3? We saw some buyback. Some money came in on Florida at 3. Bought it back down to 1.5. I think Florida's the right side. I know it's crazy to say. I know everyone watching this is going to hate that. But the truth is, Florida should not be catching points at home from UCF. No way. The reason I haven't placed the bet yet, I still might. The reason I haven't placed the bet yet, 1, I would like to see Graham Mertz playing at quarterback. He's been splitting snaps with Lagway. I think UCF's pass defense is terrible. I would like to have the better pure thrower play. So we don't really know the quarterback situation in Florida, which I don't like. But also, have these players quit on Billy Napier. Obviously, everyone has heard that he might get fired. If Florida loses this game, he may get fired. How motivated are the players? So that's what's keeping me from placing this bet right now. But on paper, as far as football goes, Florida should not be catching points from UCF. They should win this game. Motivation is huge, though. I'm not saying it's not important. So give me Florida plus 1.5. I'll let you know on the live show if I bet it. Also, I'll post it on the website if I end up placing the bet if you want to check there. But as of right now, I have Florida as a lean. Next up, we got Michigan on the road in Washington. I actually already recorded a video on this. Here it is. All right, like I said, we got Michigan on the road at Washington here. Huskies laying 2.5 points at home. Total sitting at 41.5. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to this data, action's coming in pretty heavily on the Michigan side. Over 70% of the tickets and 70% of the money on Michigan. But as I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup, and we'll start with the Michigan offense. Pretty much you know what this Michigan offense is. I mean, they're running the football. 15th in run frequency, not much of a passing attack here. Look at their passing numbers at the bottom of this graphic. 120th in yards per pass attempt, 107th in success rate per dropback, 119th in effective pass. This is a very, very one-dimensional offense. They have done a pretty solid job running the ball, though. Still sitting at 30th in OFEI, 27th in yards per carry, 52nd in success rate, 10th in effective rush. What do we always say about one-dimensional offenses, though? Makes it pretty easy to game plan for, and PJ Fleck in Minnesota really took this Michigan offense out of the game. They scored 27 points. They got the win. Just 3.95 yards per play in that game. Michigan's offense was not good. Look at their rushing numbers. 3.6 yards per carry, 155 yards rushing in the game. They got outgained by Minnesota in that game. So I know Alex Orji took over the starting quarterback job, and that Michigan offense looked like it had some energy in the USC game, but they had the element of surprise there. I mean, no one knew what the Michigan offense was going to look like with Orji at quarterback. They had no film on it. So they were able to catch UFC off guard a little bit. They had the element of surprise, I guess, if you want to put it. But you give a good defense like Minnesota couple games of film on Alex Orji, and he's able to stop it. So not a good look there for the Michigan offense. And let's give some credit to Washington's defense. They look really good. They're actually 8th in the country in yards per play allowed, 13th in success rate, 2nd in PPA. Look at their numbers against the pass. 5th in yards per attempt, 5th in success rate per dropback, 11th in effective pass. We know Michigan's not throwing the ball in this game. What we need to be looking at is their numbers against the run. 38th in yards per carry, 48th in success rate, 39th in effective rush. Look how good this Washington defense has been at home so far. They're allowing just 10.3 yards per game, 3.71 yards per play, success rate under 32%. This Washington defense has been lights out at home so far this season. Look at their numbers specifically against the run at home. Just 3.27 yards per carry allowed, 106.3 rushing yards per game allowed. No one's been able to run the ball here this year. Now, I know you might be thinking, Kyle, what about last week against Rutgers? And yeah, they lost that game. They gave up 21 points. Defense played really well. Just 4.27 yards per play allowed in that game. Yes, Monangai broke some runs. Actually, Samuel Brown broke one as well. Rutgers did break a few long runs, and they were able to run the ball in Washington. But as a whole, Washington's defense played well. They allowed 5.58 yards per carry, but that's not really indicative of how that game went. Washington looked like the better team for pretty much most of that. Trust me, this is coming from someone that was heavily rooting for Rutgers. Washington looked like the better team for most of that game. There was a couple unfortunate calls that went Rutgers' way. Well, I shouldn't say unfortunate. I was happy about it, but Washington looked like the significantly better team in that game. So you got this one-dimensional Michigan offense going on the road against a good defense and a good coaching staff. Now they have film on this one-dimensional offense. We know Michigan's not going to throw the ball. Since Orji took over as quarterback, they're averaging 59 passing yards per game, 3.75 yards per pass attempt, under a 30% success rate per dropback. So we know they're not going to throw the ball. Jed Fish, Steve Belichick, I think they're going to shut Michigan's offense down just like Minnesota did. But what about the other side? Because obviously we know Michigan's strength is certainly not their offense. Let's talk about the Washington offense. They've been very good so far this year. 12th in yards per play, 4th in success rate, 13th in PPA. Look at the passing numbers. 14th in yards per pass attempt, 9th in success rate per dropback, 19th in effective pass. They're sitting at 15th in OFEI. Will Rogers has been next to perfect this year. Over 1,300 yards passing, 9 yards per pass attempt, 10 touchdowns, no picks, A+ turnover-worthy play rate. He's protecting the football. And you want to talk about that Rutgers game that they lost? Yeah, they only 18 points per game, but they had a 55% success rate, 7.89 yards per play. 7.8. How do you lose that game with 7.89 yards per play? Look at the Washington passing numbers. Look how Will Rogers played against Rutgers. By the way, a Rutgers defense that has been very good against the pass this year. 314 passing yards, 8.5 yards per attempt, over 47% success rate per dropback. This offense looked great against Rutgers. It's crazy that Washington didn't win that game. Keep in mind, This is Fish magic, man. Jed Fish is coaching this team. We've seen the production drop off with Fafita in the Arizona offense with him leaving. He brings his magic here. Will Rogers, an established SEC quarterback. Is it that crazy that Washington, despite losing all that NFL talent, is still a dangerous offense? I don't think it is. I think they're really good. But let's not act like they're not going to have their hands full here. Michigan's defense is sitting at 4th in DFEI. Elite numbers against the run. 11th in the country in yards per carry allowed. 10th in success rate. 10th in effective rush. Passing numbers still solid, not quite as elite, but still looking solid across the board defensively. And it's not like Michigan hasn't seen quarterbacks. They played USC and Texas so far this year, Miller Moss and Quinn Ewers. And in those games, they didn't get cooked at all. In fact, they played pretty well. Just 264.5 passing yards per game allowed, 6.1 yards per pass attempt. So they've seen some good quarterbacks, and the Michigan defense held up. Granted, both those games were at home in the Big House. Now they go on the road, and there is something about this matchup I like for Washington's passing attack. Michigan, that defense is powered by the pass rush, same as last year. It's obviously different faces, but they're still trying to accomplish the same thing, get to the quarterback. Washington's actually done a really good job in pass protection. 21st in sack rate allowed, 36th in pressure rate, 40th in pass blocking grade. Now you might be thinking, well, they haven't seen a pass rush like Michigan yet, which is fair, but look how well Will Rogers has played when pressured this year. He's handled the ball great. Excellent numbers when given a clean pocket. Excellent numbers when pressured. So Will Rogers having a career year here, I think he's equipped to handle this Michigan defense. Keep in mind, this is a team that already saw Northwestern. Now, Northwestern's defense is not on Michigan's level, but that's a very good defensive front there in Northwestern. 247 yards passing, 8.2 yards per attempt, over a 64% success rate per dropback. That's crazy. 50% is very good. Over a 64%. They did whatever they wanted on Northwestern. It's a very good defense. I can't unsee what I saw in the second half last week with Minnesota. Max Brosmer, I guess it's Brosmer, by the way. I've been saying Brosmer, but the announcers in that game were saying Brosmer, so I apologize. I guess I've been saying his name wrong. Max Brosmer, this is a guy that was struggling to throw the ball on Nevada. He's an FCS transfer, and he's really been struggling this year. On the road in the Big House, marched up and down the field on the Michigan defense twice. I mean, he was 27 of 40, 258 yards, a touchdown, a pick, a 124.9 passer rating. It's not like he had an elite game, but if you watch that, he was piecing Michigan up. If Max Brosmer is able to go on the road into the Big House, outgain Michigan, get up and down the field on him like that, Will Rogers and Jed Fish in Washington certainly can, which is why the only way I'd go is Washington here. I haven't bet this yet because I think it's going to be a defensive game, and I actually think the 2.5 point spread is going to come into play. It could be a 17-16 final score somewhere in there, 2019. So I don't know if I want to lay 2.5. I do think Washington wins the game, and my pick for this video will be Washington minus 2.5. As of right now, I haven't bet it. I would love to get a cheap money line, like a minus 120. That's what I'm hoping for. I don't know. That might be wishful thinking. Those of you that jumped on that Washington plus 1.5 at open, I tip my hat. I would love to be holding a Washington plus 1.5 ticket right now. I like Washington to win this game. Washington minus 2.5 is my pick for the video. Next up, we got Duke on the road at Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech laying 9.5. I see a 10 open. Okay, that must have just popped because I looked at this like an hour ago and it wasn't there. So I do see a 10 flashing here for Georgia Tech. Total sitting at 52.5 or 53, depending on your sports book. Take a look at the pie charts, and according to this data, we are pretty split here. About 50-50 on tickets, 60% of the money on Georgia Tech. As I always say, take it with a grain of salt. So what do we think about this matchup? Well, here's the thing. Duke's offense looks pretty bad. They're 84th in OFEI. That being said, I don't really hate this matchup for Malik Murphy and the Duke offense. All they have is a passing attack. Look at their rushing numbers. I mean, their run game is non-existent. 83rd in yards per carry, 116th in success rate, 103rd in effective rush. This is not a good rushing attack, but when Malik Murphy has time in the pocket, he can definitely beat you with his arm. We saw it in the Northwestern game. Northwestern was generating pressure for the first 3 quarters. They were in control of that game. Defense must have got tired. Pressure stopped getting home. In the 4th quarter, Malik Murphy drove the ball up and down the field and then sent the game to overtime. Won the game in overtime, all with his arm. In case you're unfamiliar with the Georgia Tech defense, they don't defend the pass well at all. In fact, they're one of the worst pass defenses in the country, probably the worst pass defense in the ACC. 106th in yards per pass attempt allowed, 118th in success rate per dropback, 122nd in effective pass. Look at Georgia Tech's pass defense numbers against Syracuse and Louisville. And the reason I chose these two games, these are Georgia Tech's two games against teams that have talented quarterbacks. They allowed 325 yards per game through the air in those two. 11.25 yards per pass attempt is wild. Over 55% success rate per dropback. Georgia Tech has gotten cooked the two times they saw quarterbacks. Malik Murphy is most definitely a quarterback. Remember, if it wasn't for Arch Manning, Malik Murphy would probably be taking over the Texas job after Quinn Ewers next year. And I just mentioned how Malik Murphy will cook you if you don't get pressure on him. Want to know who's been terrible in terms of rushing the passer? Georgia Tech. Terrible pass rush. 127th in pass rush grade, 120th in sack rate, 126th in pressure rate. Not to mention, Duke's offensive line has actually been pretty good in pass protection. 9th in pressure rate allowed, 16th in hurry rate allowed. Look at Malik Murphy's splits. I mean, it's pretty clear. If he has a clean pocket, he's going to beat you. If he doesn't, he'll struggle. Georgia Tech doesn't have much of a pass rush. I like this matchup for Malik Murphy. But what about the other side? Obviously, Georgia Tech's offense is the strength of the team, right? Haynes King, Jamal Haynes, they're an offensive program. They're 26th in OFEI, 23rd in yards per play, 20th in success rate. Here's the thing. Duke's defense looks really good. I thought Duke's defense was going to fall off. They lost a bunch of production. Obviously, Mike Elko left. He went and took the Texas A&M job. They really haven't. That defense looks great. And honestly, I really don't know what I think about the Georgia Tech offense anymore. They started off the season looking great, right? They beat Florida State, then they beat Georgia State. In those two games, they averaged 31.5 points per game, 6.91 yards per play. And at the time, we were like, wow, they were moving the ball in Florida State. Looking back now, that's not that impressive. And look at their two games since, or their two FBS games. I'm not including the FCS game. Look at their two FBS games since those two. Just 23.5 points per game. Yards per play is down. Success rate is down. This offense doesn't look that great. Now, if you are betting Georgia Tech in this game, you're probably looking right here. And this is the biggest question mark when it comes to Duke's defense. They haven't really seen anybody in terms of an offense. I mean, the best offense they've seen is North Carolina, and they're dealing with their second or third string quarterback at this point. The North Carolina offense isn't very good. So that's the argument here. Duke's defense looks great, but they've played nobody. Georgia Tech will be by far the best offense they've seen so far this year. Personally, that's not enough. This Duke defense looks great, and honestly, if you ask me, Georgia Tech should not be laying double digits here, especially against Malik Murphy, who I think is a tough matchup for him. I think Malik Murphy's going to throw the ball all over Georgia Tech. So now that a 10 popped, let's do it. I didn't bet this yet, but I'm going to bet it right after I'm done recording. Give me Duke plus 10 next game. Next up, Kansas, Arizona State. Already did a video on this one. Here it is. All right, like I said, Kansas is on the road in Arizona State for this one. Sun Devils are laying 3. Looks like all the 3.5s are gone. So Arizona State's now laying 3. Total sitting at 50.5 or 50, depending on your sports book. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to this data that I don't trust, action's coming in heavy on the Arizona State side. Over 70% of the tickets, over 70% of the money on Arizona State. But as I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup. We'll start with the Kansas offense. As we know, this is an offense that relies on running the ball. They're 46th in run frequency so far. They've done a really good job with it. They're sitting at 21st in yards per carry, 25th in success rate, 13th in effective rush. Offense is back at 41st in OFEI, which is definitely disappointing. But that hasn't been the fault of the run game. That's really on Jalen Daniels, who's really off to a rough start. Cannot protect the football. 802 yards, 6.2 yards per attempt, 5 touchdowns, 8 interceptions so far. So Jalen Daniels definitely not off to the start we expected here. And when you take a look at this Arizona State defense, at first glance, you might be like, oh man, this is a really tough matchup for Kansas. Arizona State's 8th in the country in yards per carry allowed. I mean, they've played great defense against the run, 25th in run defense success rate. Look at the numbers from their 2 home games. I mean, just 1.21 yards per carry allowed in those games, 35 rushing yards per game. So in their 2 games at home in Tempe, no one was able to run the ball on Arizona State. Now, granted, Mississippi State and Wyoming, that's who those games were against. Neither team can run the football at all. Kansas rushing attack doesn't even belong in the same sentence as those 2 programs. But are we seeing this Kansas rushing attack slow down a bit? Through the first 3 games, they were averaging almost 6.4 yards per carry, over 238 rushing yards per game, over a 57% success rate. Look at their last 2 games against West Virginia and TCU. By the way, 2 teams that, I mean, those aren't elite defenses or anything, 5.27 yards per carry, 208 rushing yards per game, success rate down close to 40%. So the rushing production hasn't been quite as explosive in the last couple games against West Virginia and TCU as it looked the first few games of the season. And if you look at the DFEI ratings, I mean, Arizona State's defense is significantly better than West Virginia's and TCU's. They're at 38th. Those two teams are at 82nd and 78th. And it's not like Arizona State's defense hasn't seen anybody. It's not like they're racking up defensive stats against bad offenses. Look at their last two games. Texas State has a pretty powerful offense. I mean, they're 57th in OFEI. Texas Tech 45th. So Kansas at 41st. That's not a huge jump in production. Maybe in terms of a rushing attack, it's a jump, but I mean, this Arizona State team, it's not like they're playing nobody. In those last two games against Texas State and Texas Tech, Arizona State held their own on the ground. Just 4 yards per carry, allowed 134 rushing yards per game in those two. Now, again, these two offenses as a whole might be slightly comparable to Kansas, but in terms of a rushing attack alone, Kansas is on a different level. I mean, this is Devin Neal, Jalen Daniels using his legs. This is a very good rushing attack. Texas Tech and Texas State don't really compare. So it is definitely a step up in competition, but overall, I like this Arizona State defensive front to keep the Kansas rushing attack from absolutely smoking them. That being said, I actually like the matchup for Jalen Daniels, and I know that sounds crazy based on what we've seen from him so far this year, but Arizona State, as solid as they've been against the run, they don't have much of a pass rush. They're just 110th in the country in pressure rate, 107th in pass rush grade. This defense has not been able to generate consistent pressure on opposing quarterbacks, and the reason that's significant, Jalen Daniels, as bad as he's been, his struggles mostly come when he's pressured. Look at these splits here. Actually, when he's given a clean pocket, he really hasn't been that bad. It's when he's pressured, I mean, towards the bottom of college football when he receives pressure. I don't think Arizona State's going to be able to get pressure on him in this one. So as crazy as it sounds, I think Jalen Daniels might have a big game throwing the ball, kind of like what we saw from Blake Shapen in that home game for Arizona State. I mean, Mississippi State came in here. They couldn't run the ball. We already talked about their run defense. Blake Shapen was 18 of 28, 268 yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks, 168 passer rating. And if you watch that game, Arizona State won, but they had an early defensive touchdown and a huge halftime lead. Mississippi State almost came all the way back. In fact, you could argue that Mississippi State looked like the better team for most of that game. So overall on this side of the ball, I know some people are big on this Arizona State defense, and it has looked pretty good. I like Kansas to move the football. But what about on the other side? What do we think of the Arizona State offense? Well, we've seen night and day production from this unit. Right now, they're sitting at 60th in yards per play, 33rd in success rate. On the ground, 59th in yards per carry, 25th in success rate, 49th in effective rush. Unfortunately, the crazy production we saw on the ground from the first 2 weeks seems to be gone. 5.83 yards per carry, 300 rushing yards per game through the first 2 games. Look at the rushing numbers from their last 2 games. I mean, Scatterbo just isn't doing it anymore. In their last 2 games, just 2.71 yards per carry, under 100 rushing yards per game. A 17.2% success rate is terrible. So this run game that looks so dominant in the first couple of weeks for Arizona State just hasn't looked like that at all. And by the way, Kansas, I know they're not really branded as a defensive program. They've actually been playing pretty solid defense against the run. 49th in the country in yards per carry, 67th in success rate isn't great, 33rd in effective rush. We saw Kansas matched up against 2 explosive rushing attacks, UNLV and West Virginia, 2 very dynamic, very good rushing attacks. In those games, they allowed 165 rushing yards per game, just 4.18 yards per carry. So they held their own against 2 very good rushing attacks. Both I would consider better than the Arizona State rushing attack. The problem with this Kansas defense has been, I mean, the secondary, they can't cover anybody. On their last 2 games against West Virginia and TCU, they're allowing over 325 passing yards per game, almost 10 yards per attempt, and over a 50% success rate per dropback. So they're really struggling to defend the pass right now. But here's the thing. Sam Leavitt doesn't really scare me as a thrower. He's got 855 yards on the season, 7.7 yards per attempt, 3 touchdowns, picks, an F big-time throw rate, meaning he's not getting the ball downfield much. He didn't do anything through the air in that Mississippi State game, just 69 yards passing, 3.5 yards per attempt, under a 24% success rate per dropback. And since then, okay, maybe he's been a little bit better, but still, yeah, he's completing over 60% of his passes, 264 passing yards per game, 1 touchdown, 2 picks, and a 125.8 passer rating. So, look, this Kansas pass defense looks terrible, but Garrett Green and Josh Hoover, okay, they're both much better than Sam Leavitt in terms of throwing the ball. So I actually like the matchup for Kansas defense, which is why I took one of those 3.5s. Unfortunately, I think they're gone now, but I'd still play Kansas at 3. I think this should come down to the wire. I actually think Kansas is live. I think Kansas wins this game. I know some of you might be hesitant to bet Kansas. I had them as a top bet. I think it was 2 weeks ago, and they blew that lead. Yeah, it was 2 weeks ago. They blew that lead to West Virginia, an 11-point lead with like 3 minutes. Oh, my God. It makes me sick to even talk about it. So Kansas broke my heart a couple weeks back, but I do think they win this game. So getting +3, it's a must play for me. I'm on Kansas. I got the 3.5, still play it at 3. Next up is Texas Tech, Arizona State. Already recorded a video on this one. Here it is. All right, like I said, Texas Tech is on the road here. Arizona laying 6, pretty much 6 across the board. There is a 5.5 there if you look. Total sitting at 63.5 or 64, depending on your sports book. Let's take a look at the pie charts, and according to this data that I don't trust, action is coming in on the Arizona side. Almost 60% of the tickets and 65% of the money on the Wildcats. But again, as I always say, take this data with a grain of salt. So let's get into this matchup. We'll start with the Texas Tech offense sitting at 28th in pass frequency, 8th in pace. And that's not new. That's pretty much what you can expect to see from the Texas Tech offense every single year. They throw the ball a lot, run a crazy fast pace. So far in the season, they've been okay. They're 55th in OFEI, 35th in yards per play, 51st in success rate, 28th in PPA. Definitely not seeing the explosive passing numbers, but they are 26th in effective pass, which obviously isn't bad. The concern here is this game is on the road, and we'll get into this, but you can see here their only road game was at Washington State in Pullman. Just 16 points scored in the game, 5.64 yards per play. They actually almost had 500 yards of offense in the game, but they just kept shooting themselves in the foot. If you look at the numbers in their other 4 games, they average 48 points per game, 6.7 yards per play, over 46% success rate. So the offense has looked good other than the Washington State game where it really didn't even look that bad, not as bad as the final score indicated. Aaron Morton putting up some nice looking numbers on the season, over 1,400 yards passing, 7.4 yards per attempt, 14 touchdowns, 1 interception. But like I said earlier, this game is on the road in Arizona, and that's been a problem for Baron Morton. Here are his home-away splits from this season. Now, we're only talking about one game in Washington State, but he's got 13 touchdowns and no interceptions at home this year. 1 touchdown, 2 picks in his road game. Look at the passer rating, 166.8 to 104.2. Completion percentage down as well. Now, you might be thinking, well, Kyle, it's just one game, one road game. Who cares? Well, look at his splits from last year. Same deal. 56.5% completions on the road last year compared to over 67% at home. Touchdown to interception ratio, 8-2 at home, 4-5 on the road. Look at the passer rating. Drops from 145 to 99.8. So no question, Baron Morton not nearly as productive away from Lubbock. So the fact that this game's being played in Arizona is definitely a concern if you're a Texas Tech fan or if you plan on betting Texas Tech. Here are Arizona's defensive numbers on the year. They actually look all right. I mean, as you know, under Jed Fish, Arizona was not a defensive program. Certainly taking a step forward this year. They're 68th in yards per play, 59th in success rate, 62nd in PPA, sitting at 77th in DFEI, which isn't great. I expect that to climb. Look at the pass defense numbers. 43rd in yards per pass attempt, 61st in success rate, but 41st in effective pass. This year's Arizona defense is much better than last year's. However, I do have a bit of a concern here for Arizona. Texas Tech's offensive line has been great in pass protection. They're actually 7th in the country in pass blocking grade, 19th in sack rate allowed, 30th in pressure rate allowed. The strength of this Arizona defense so far has been the pass rush. They're 27th in pass rush grade, 13th in pressure rate, 9th in pass rush win rate. So Arizona's been having a lot of success rushing the passer. Might not be there against Texas Tech. Their offensive line's been good in pass protection, and that's especially concerning when you look at these splits here. Baron Morton has great numbers when given a clean pocket. It's when you get pressure on him is when he starts to struggle. So Arizona's pass rush needs to be there, and Texas Tech's been great in pass protection. So I like that matchup for Texas Tech. But here's the thing. I do question the strength of schedule for Texas Tech's offense. How many defenses has this team seen? I mean, here are their game logs here. The only legitimate defense that Texas Tech has seen so far is Arizona State. And look at their numbers in that game. 3.8 yards per carry, 4.6 yards per pass attempt. Sure, the Texas Tech offense looked great against Abilene Christian or Washington State, who can't stop anybody. We saw what Genty and Boise State just did to them. North Texas never plays any defense. Cincinnati doesn't have a good defense this year. The only time they've seen a legitimate defense was Arizona State. They couldn't really do much offensively, and now they're going on the road to play Arizona, whose defense might be about on the same level as Arizona State. So I don't like this matchup for Texas Tech's offense. I mean, you got Baron Morton on the road. You got Texas Tech winning 3 games in a row, looking impressive, putting big numbers on the scoreboard. Just seems like a really nice spot to sell high on Texas Tech's offense. But what about the other side? What about the Arizona offense? Now, obviously, we know this is another offense powered by the pass, 16th in passing frequency. They run a much slower pace, though, 125th. In pace. So they're not like Texas Tech running a snap every 15 seconds. They're actually taking their time. They will be throwing the ball a lot. And so far, they've been pretty good. 25th in yards per pass attempt allowed, 72nd in success rate, 17th in effective pass. The offense as a whole is sitting at 24th in OFEI. Yeah, Fafita kind of let us down in that Kansas. Well, he didn't let me down. I was on Kansas State. But I think on that big game on Friday night against Kansas State wasn't his best effort. But as a whole, he has been making plays this year. He's averaging over 8 yards per pass attempt, 8.2 to be exact, 7 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. But his turnover-worthy play rate is sitting towards the top of the country, so may have gotten a little unlucky on those interceptions. What concerns me most for Fafita is he kind of did all of his damage against New Mexico. 422 yards and 4 touchdowns against New Mexico. Look at his game logs in the other ones. I mean, Northern Arizona, they didn't really ask him to do much. I mean, they blew him out. It's an FCS team. But the 2 games since then, at Kansas State and at Utah, they really haven't been great. But here's the thing. Texas Tech's defense is most definitely not Kansas State and Utah. In fact, Kansas State and Utah probably both have top 25 defenses this year, and both those games were on the road. Now he comes back home and sees the Texas Tech defense, which looks pretty terrible on paper. Granted, they've been dealing with injuries this year, but 94th in yards per play allowed, 100th in success rate, 105th in PPA, really struggling against the pass. 87th in yards per pass attempt allowed, 102nd in success rate per dropback, 102nd in effective pass. Texas Tech's been getting cooked through the air, which is music to the ears of Arizona fan and Noah Fafita, who really needs to have a big game. He needs to get back on track. Some more good news for Noah Fafita. Texas Tech has been struggling in the pass rush department. They're actually 129th in sack rate, 100th in pass rush grade, 67th in pressure rate. Arizona done a very good job in pass protection. 45th in sack rate allowed, 66th in pressure rate. So Fafita should have time to throw in the pocket. He's also handled pressure really well this year. So even if Texas Tech is able to win some of their pass rush battles, Fafita should be fine. And something else we need to mention about Texas Tech's defense, they haven't seen a slew of talented quarterbacks yet in terms of throwing the ball. I mean, Mateer at Washington State, he's more of a runner. Chandler Rogers in North Texas is okay. Arizona State, Sam Leavitt, he's not the greatest thrower of the ball. Last week against Cincinnati, we finally saw them see Sorsby, who looks pretty good throwing the football this year. He cooked on Texas Tech. 426 yards passing, 9.5 yards per attempt, almost a 50% success rate. Fafita, I mean, entering the season, we were expecting him to be much better than any of these quarterbacks. It should be Texas Tech's pass defense toughest test of the year. So I think Fafita has a big bounce back game coming off the 2 tough road games against 2 tough defenses. Now he comes home against the Texas Tech pass defense that's struggling. I think he cooks. So as you probably guessed, I like Arizona to light the scoreboard up in this one. I think they score a bunch of points. I do think they cover the number, but actually the way I bet it, in the last video I uploaded, I talked about Louisville and how I thought they'll give SMU's run game that seems unstoppable problems. I like Louisville to win that game. So the bet I actually placed, Arizona money line, Louisville money line, parlay. I mean, they're both 6-point favorites, so it turns out to be kind of the same thing as a 6-point teaser. I got it at plus 108. So Arizona money line, Louisville money line parlay, plus 108. All right, so I'm out of time. It's after 1 a.m. I can't go through any more. The live show at 10 a.m., we're going to go through 30 games. So if you're able to make it to the live show, we'll go through them all. We'd love to see you in the comments. If you want to just skip to the website and see what bets I placed, head over to kylekirms.com and click on open bets. I'll also post my top bets, parlays of the day, that kind of stuff. That'll all be posted up there. So if you're interested in any of that, head over to the website and sign up. Let's have ourselves a nice Saturday. See you all bright and early, 10 a.m. Eastern time. Later.